So we just started talking about de-Stalinization and Khrushchev's secret speech against Stalin, right? And basically after he gives this secret speech, then he has, in a lot of ways, the mandate that he needs ultimately to reform the economy, to try to ultimately help it really recover, because what we were seeing was that the Western economy was really recovering well under the Marshall Plan, but the East was not. So how ultimately does de-Stalinization work? Well, what it's called is Gosplan. And ultimately what the main focus was to shift production from heavy industry and the military more towards consumer goods and agriculture. This doesn't mean that military production is going to completely go away. We know, of course, because of the Cold War, there are proliferation of nuclear weapons and so on. But the idea is for, in particular, for more consumer goods to be produced, and also to make sure that agriculture can amply feed the large population. So essentially what Gosplan is centralized economic planning. The idea was for Khrushchev to prove that communism was the superior economic structure to capitalism. What Khrushchev wanted to do was to make the USSR essentially serve as the model communist state to the rest of the world. So Khrushchev also is starting to woo other countries outside of his already sphere of influence at this point. So he's trying to woo states in Asia and Africa, even ones that were not communist. But what he's doing is he's promising them, oh, you can buy our products that we're now producing, right? Because, now we're producing more consumer goods that all these outside countries want to buy. Or also, oh, we'll lend you money if you're not doing well financially. So basically, the idea is that Khrushchev might possibly be able to spread communist ideas far beyond their borders. Of course, this again is a threat to the West with their idea of containment. So Khrushchev, literally, before the United Nations, he ends up saying to them, "We will bury you." In other words, his plan under Gosplan, under de-Stalinization, is to basically eclipse the American and the Allies' economy through Gosplan, through continuing to sort of court other countries. And what you're going to see is that Gosplan is effective in the sense that the standard of living in Soviet-influenced areas is going to gradually improve. You're also going to see that de-Stalinization allows people to be able to express themselves more artistically. This is a huge contrast from what we saw just recently under Stalin. We talked about how even Sergei Eisenstein was subject to purging, even though Eisenstein was kind of a huge propaganda maker for the Soviet Union earlier in the 1930s. But what we're going to see is that de-Stalinization sort of allows people to speak out a little bit against, I guess, the status quo. So two predominant examples that would be good to be familiar with would be Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zviago, which is a story about an intellectual who actually rejects the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism by saying that they're brutal, right? And in this story, the protagonist, the guy who rejects the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism, he ends up actually getting destroyed. But it's still important because the character is still kind of revered as a hero. It is seen that the character is so heroic because of his humanity and Christian spirit. And as we know, the Soviet Union was very much a secular state. So just the fact that you could have a main character, a heroic character, go against communism was a huge change. And that shows you how much de-Stalinization sort of opened up the door for people to maybe express dissenting voices in the arts. Another example is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And this is actually about a person who spent time in a Stalinist gulag, right? So it basically is portraying how harsh and violent and terrible it was to actually be sentenced to one of these labor camps, right? So again, this is very critical of Stalin's policies, and it gives you a sense of how kind of far beyond Stalin Khrushchev is willing to go ultimately to propel the USSR forward. And it's definitely no secret to Khrushchev how harsh Stalin was. So it's not really that surprising that he's willing to accept these new forms of expression. Um, so what you're going to see is that according to de-Stalinization, you're going to have certain countries kind of feel like they're getting a little bit of a taste of freedom. We saw that people could express themselves artistically. We saw that the economy was starting to develop in a more positive direction. So what we're actually seeing is that a lot of communist reformers and just the general masses are kind of hoping to get greater liberty and national independence. And you're also going to see that Khrushchev actually was willing to let countries sort of experiment with their own different forms of socialism within their countries, as long as the Communist Party remained in control. So just, allowing a little bit more flexibility with how to approach the economy, and that's a huge change from Stalin. So a couple of examples about how this actually pans out. In 1956 in Poland, you're going to have riots break out, and what this is going to do is actually you're going to have more than 9,000 political prisoners who previously were imprisoned for dissenting against the kind of hardline Stalinistic approach to the economy. So when these political prisoners are released, one of them is a previous purge leader named Gomulka, Walter Gomulka. Sorry, it's hard to say. And what he does is he actually kind of emerges as a leader again, and he helps Poland win greater autonomy. But he also makes sure that as they are doing this, there isn't too much anti-Soviet feeling that arises. So essentially what you're going to see is that Poland is able to get some reforms, able to have a slightly different form of socialism, and have a little bit more autonomy, which sort of inspires the Hungarians to do the same thing. So in Hungary, you're going to have students and workers in Budapest decide that they want a more liberal leader. So they're going to install a leader named Imre Nagy, who is a liberal communist reformer, and they're going to make him the new chief in October of 1956. You're going to also have Hungarian nationalists basically stage these really big demonstrations in Budapest, and what they're demanding is that non-communist parties be legalized again. And the thing that makes this sort of doomed is that these demonstrations quickly turn violent and armed, right? So the people who are protesting all have weapons, and ultimately, there's a huge fear among the Russian government that this could easily turn into, it could turn into a possible civil war. It could turn into a very violent conflict. What the Hungarians were hoping was that they would get some U.S. assistance for their independence, right? They kind of see this as an example of the Truman Doctrine. The idea is, of course, that Truman said that Western countries would do anything that they could to help a country struggling with communism. But in another way, you could see this as kind of going beyond the policy of containment, because Hungary was communist already. The containment policy basically said to stop the spread of communism, not to go into an already communist country and turn it into a capitalist one. So despite the fact that the Hungarians really hoped that the U.S. were going to intervene in their rebellion, the U.S. does not. And so what happens instead is you have Soviet tanks basically just go into Budapest and crush the democratic revolution. And then a new leader replaces Nagy. His name is János Kadar, and he instills a very firm communist rule in Hungary. So what you're going to have after that is a lot of other Eastern nations are going to sort of fall. Sorry, that's blocked off there. It says fall in line. So other Eastern countries kind of see what happens with Hungary, and they see how brutally they are crushed by the Soviets. And so most other Eastern European countries kind of hope to have little democratic gains, but they continue to really obediently follow the USSR in all foreign affairs. So it's important to kind of see the difference between the Polish riots and the Hungarian uprising. The Polish riots being a little bit more successful, with the Poles getting some autonomy and freedom, but the Hungarians basically being completely crushed. So that is it for the Eastern Bloc, and we will continue on with the next video momentarily.